let's now move on to your fourth part in risk assessment. This is the last step in the risk assessment process, which is risk evaluation. So now, the three basic steps, as we have already discussed, is identification, characterization, and evaluation. So what is risk evaluation? It is the crucial step between your characterization and the application of the appropriate mitigation steps. This risk evaluation, though, is subjective. We will identify the risk as high or low and its acceptability to you, your institution, or your environment. So what is an acceptable risk for you? Like, for example, take into consideration the picture on the right. Is the risk of falling acceptable to you because you don't have a harness? If it's not acceptable, what mitigation steps would you do so that you will not fall? So risk evaluation is related with the concept of risk acceptance. And this acceptance can vary between the culture, the experience, the resources, the management, and even current events that surrounds the hazard. So, for example, with COVID-19, day to day, the risk acceptance changes depending on new information we have on the pathogen. Unfortunately, there is no systematic way to determine the acceptability because it is only a perception between the person doing the assessment, the facility requesting for the assessment, and even the community where the facility is located. So what are some of the factors that will affect the acceptability? For example, professional goals, financial goals, educational goals, personal health of the individual. Second would be for the institution. Like some institution will have a lot to lose if an agent is released from the laboratory or gets sick from the pathogen. There are also some legal issues and regulation or compliance problems. In the community, you want to maintain the community being healthy. As such, you don't want the release of pathogens. So these are just some of the factors that can affect the evaluation and acceptance of the risk. So, if an institution finds a particular risk unacceptable, it will either stop the work altogether or find ways to lower the risk so that it will become a level which is acceptable. So with this, you will now have mitigation steps. The community's risk acceptability level is still important because if the community and the institution will be in conflict, then it may not be able to operate normally because the community might have always issues and they would have problems with either the government or the people. They might actually prevent the people from going to the facility. So it is always important to take note that the community has a voice in the decision for the evaluation. So only an institution can determine, though, whether the risk is very high, moderate, low, or very low. The community cannot dictate what the institution will say. They can have only cultural or other background that they would want to be healthy, but it is the institution who should determine the risk. So how can risk evaluation be depicted in the graph? We have already done this in the previous lecture, and the curves are called isoquants that shows the different levels. Now, it is important to remember that the location of these lines or curves are arbitrary. Why? Because this is the essence of risk evaluation. Arbitrary because these curves can actually change depending on the perception of those who are doing the assessment. So different institutions will have different shapes of the curve. Some will say, I don't like the risk, so they will move the curves towards low so that even if it's in the middle, it will become very high. So now they are called risk-averse groups. On the other hand, if they move the curve towards the very high because they say, okay, the risk is acceptable to me, then they might actually be risk tolerant. So let's say you can see here, the risk is same for all three risk assessment, but the lines would be different. Like as you can see, if risk averse, it's now very high. But for risk tolerant, it would be very low. So the isoquants is again arbitrary depending on your assessment. So risk evaluation drives investment decisions in an institution. Why? Because again, mitigation steps will cost money, specifically if you will employ engineering controls. So if an institution is risk averse, it will use more money compared to a risk tolerant institution. So again, if we will have a likelihood averse institution, then you can see here that any high institution is already high risk. On the other hand, if it's a consequence averse, you can see that any high consequence already falls to high risk. So as you can see, the isoquants is still dependent on type of aversion of the institution. Is it likelihood averse? Is it consequence averse? Or it is risk default? So again, an institution that considered a certain risk high would use large amount of resources, whereas another institution that considers the same risk to be moderate would be maybe using smaller amount of resources. Again, it is dependent on the institution. That ends your risk assessment steps. And the last lecture will be all about final notes on risk assessment.